If you spit in the air, it lands in your face. I'm sure most of you probably know where that comes from, and there's probably some of you who are a little taken back as to why I'm opening my sermon talking about spit in the face. But just a quick show of hands, how many of you know where that quote comes from, what movie that comes from? No? The Fiddler on the Roof. I watched that for the first time a few weeks ago, and it opened up a whole new understanding of my wife and her family. And before you get any crazy ideas, let me go ahead and tell you why. This movie was one of Stephanie and her family's favorite movies growing up. She watched it all throughout her childhood, especially as it came to the Christmas season, which meant that naturally, quotes and songs from that movie weave their way into the everyday fabric of this family. I, on the other hand, I didn't watch a single musical all throughout my life prior to my marriage, which meant every and any quote from a musical went clear over my head. And when I was around Stephanie's family, a lot of the references just passed me by. I mean, they were so fluent in this movie that nobody thought to stop and explain, oh, this is from Fiddler on the Roof. I just thought they were kind of being quirky with some of the things they were saying, but it turned out they were actually speaking a different language in front of me. And a few nights ago, I finally decoded the message. After 9 years of marriage, Stephanie and her family, we turned a new chapter, and I finally understand them in a different way. And the funny thing is, it actually took 9 years for Stephanie to get me to watch this movie. And then I did, and suddenly I'm just flipping through the pages of my memory going, oh my goodness, that's what you've been saying this whole time. That's what you've been singing this whole time. I was confused, but now I understand. Now I get it. Has something like that ever happened to you? I mean, you show up late to a meeting and you just begin backpedaling, trying to understand what in the world everybody is talking about. You show up late to class and you are frantically thumbing through the pages of the textbook, trying to catch up with the rest of the class. Or maybe you had that awkward experience where you walk into a group and they're telling a joke, but you showed up late and everybody begins laughing except you because you didn't know it was a joke. Or maybe you sit down to watch a movie and it's already halfway over and you're trying to understand, what is this movie about? Right? When that happens, we feel lost. We feel confused about what is going on. Who is this person? What's the situation? Where are things heading? Christmas is a lot like that. Many people, if they're going to read the Christmas story from the Bible, they crack open to the birth of Jesus, right? But the birth of Jesus is not the beginning of the story. The truth is, the birth of Jesus isn't the beginning of the story, it's in the middle of the story. Starting at the middle and then trying to make sense of the rest of the story, it gets confusing. If we were to crack open a novel to the middle of a story, we would have a very hard time trying to make sense of the story at all. There would be characters that we didn't know anything about because there was no character development. All of the allusions, we wouldn't know what they were pointing back to, and there would be conversations taking place that would completely escape our notice or confuse us. Things like, the good book says. It would just kind of go right over our heads. Most people for Christmas, they pick up with Jesus, the baby, unaware that what we are doing is we are starting with the baby in the manger, and by doing so, we jump to the middle of the story, missing the beginning of the story. Without the beginning, we won't be able to make sense of the middle, and we'll be confused about the end. So what I want to do today is I want to back up, and I want to talk about the beginning of the story, so that we can make sense about this middle part, the middle part that we call Christmas. And if you have your Bibles, you want to follow along, we're going to be spending the bulk of our time in two passages today. Matthew chapter 2 and then Genesis chapter 3. Matthew 2, Genesis 3. So open up with me to Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 13. It's a story of the wise men. We know this Christmas story. You know, King Herod, you have Mary, Joseph, and you have Jesus, and they flee from trouble. Starting in verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Now, contrary to the song, these aren't kings, okay? These aren't the we three kings. These are pagan astrologers who no doubt they had some sort of active practice with the religious and political environment of the East. But they show up to worship Jesus. Verse 2, and they asked, "Where's the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." A baby born king, right? This should immediately clue us in to ask, why is there a need for a new king? Why is there a need for a new king? If we start here in the middle of the story, we cannot answer that question. Continuing in verse 3. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. Why is Herod bothered by the birth of a baby? Aren't babies exciting? Like, we throw parties when a baby is born, and shouldn't the birth of a new king for their people make them excited? I mean, besides all of that, what is intimidating about a baby? It's a baby. Well, he is, and so is everybody else, and so here's what he does, verse 4. When he had called together all the people, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them, where is the Messiah, where the Messiah was to be born? In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied. For this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So we get a little bit more details with this passage. The king clarifies that this isn't just any king, this is the Messiah, which for the Jewish people, the Messiah was the coming king who would liberate his people from oppression. And so Herod, he summons up all the Bible scholars, and he asks them, hey, where is this Messiah to be born? And so we learn that there was an ancient promise about a future king who would come to liberate his people, and he would be born in the town of Bethlehem. And two questions, though. First, why is there a need for a new king? I mean, Herod's on the throne. Why do we need a new one? Second, why is Herod so bent out of shape about God sending a king to help his people? Why is he bent out of shape about God, the king, coming to liberate and save his people? Let's continue, verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report back to me, so that I too may go and worship him. I mean, deception is oozing out of Herod. Now, he goes to the Magi in secret, really to kill the newborn baby, the newborn king. And what happens next is that they go to the house where Jesus is, the Magi, and Jesus, at this point, he's a few years old. Jesus is toddler status. And they present their gifts to him in worship and recognition as Jesus the King. The Magi, they get told not to go back to Herod because of Herod's evil plot. And so they head back home another way. And no doubt, Herod gets word that the Magi didn't come back and report where Jesus was, and he is furious. Maybe Herod saw them going a different route. Maybe some of in the administration saw that. But they are furious because they wanted to deceive them so he could kill Jesus. And they were warned in a dream not to go back, and so they promptly left. And so Herod's tricks, it got turned in on himself. Meanwhile, Herod just loses it. He loses it. He goes on a rampage. Verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. He flies off the rails and he goes on the manhunt for Jesus to kill him. And if you're reading the story for the first time, one of the things that you may begin to sense is that there is a conflict. There's a conflict between two kings. There's a conflict between two kingdoms. Herod the king, he's threatened, so he acts deceptively so that he could kill this newborn king. Verse 16, When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. If you're familiar with the biblical story, if you're familiar with the Bible, this genocide that Herod orders for should be a familiar or a memorable story for us. It should be memorable because of Moses, right? The birth of Moses. The birth of the liberator ruler, the king, who would free God's people from slavery. Pharaoh saw these Hebrews who were just multiplying and grow to such a population that he was threatened. His own kingdom was threatened by them. And so what did he do? He enslaved them with harsh labor. He began oppressing the Israelites because he feared them. His goal appeared to be keep them so busy with such hard work that they won't have any time to think about anything else but this hard labor. And it got so bad that Pharaoh thinks there is surely going to be an uprising. Where does the uprising come from? It comes from the men. And so what we need to do is we need to stop boys from being born here in Egypt. How do we stop that? Well, we have to stop the women from giving birth to boys. So since we can't stop that from happening, here's what I'll do. Exodus chapter 1, verse 16. He orders this to happen for the midwives. He says, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. And when he realizes that people in his kingdom are going, this is wicked. I'm not going to do this, and it's not working out. He just orders, hey, Hebrew parents, you need to do this. Go ahead and just drown your own kids. Verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people because it's not working. He says, every Hebrew boy that is born you, throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. What horror. I mean, what wickedness can fill somebody up to do such awful things? But this story, it sounds strangely familiar, doesn't it? What happens in the Christmas story between Herod and Jesus is just like what happened in the Exodus between Pharaoh and Moses. Both kings, they are threatened, and so they order for the execution of every child. But why? I mean, what is so threatening about babies? What is so threatening about babies? Well, I guess there's one thing, at least for me. Our son Judah, he's 3 months old at this point, which is crazy. But one thing that's threatening, that threatens me, and this is a horror that threatens me, is the thought of picking up this cute bobblehead and then having him like projectile vomit on my face. Or, if not knowing this, that hasn't happened yet. Or picking him up and not realizing that he had a severe blowout and I didn't catch that in time and I get it all over me, right? That's a threat to me, a real honest threat about babies. But if we just turn to the Christmas story in our Bibles, starting in the middle of the story, we sense that there are pieces to the puzzle missing. There are details in the story that we are not seeing. And while we may acknowledge on the surface what is said in the Christmas story, we won't understand the significance of what is being said. If you walk into your family Christmas gathering and you realize there's food on the table, but nobody's sitting at the table eating that food, but everybody's by themselves sitting alone, eating their food with angry faces, you would reasonably think something happened before I walked into the room to make everybody upset with each other. And you might, in fact, launch on an investigation to figure out what in the world took place. That's the scene that we walk into on the Christmas story. There is a conflict afoot. We're not told what it is. We're not told what it's about. We just are told it's there. So the glaring question is, what are we missing in the story? What pieces of the puzzle do we need to have in order to better understand the middle part of the story, the Christmas story today? Well, this is Matthew 2. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 3. because Genesis sets the stage for the conflict that we find here in Matthew. In the first 2 chapters of Genesis, we have God creating everything. And He makes the earth, and then He puts Adam and Eve in it, in this magnificent garden. And He tells them to tend it and take care of it. And God tells them, be fruitful. Translation, have a lot of babies, guys. Fill the earth. Enjoy the fullness of the garden. Eat from all the trees except one tree. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God says, the moment you eat it, the moment you touch it, you will die. Death is going to enter into the creation. It's going to mess everything up. Don't touch the tree. And thus slithers onto the scene a deceptive creature, the serpent. Now, the serpent here is not of the origin story of how snakes started to slither on their belly. Okay, that's not what this story is about. The serpent stands for this evil angelic figure who is responsible for leading the first rebellion against God and God's new world. The serpent, like Herod, speaks deception. Here's what he says in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The serpent is so clever because God did not say, don't eat from all of the trees, don't eat from any of the tree. And the serpent is just totally setting Eve up here. She doesn't realize it, and so she corrects the serpent, but that's exactly what he wanted her to do. She tells him, oh, God didn't say don't eat from any tree. He said don't eat from that tree. And so the serpent deceptively spits back this in Genesis 3, verse 4. It says, you will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman. In other words, oh, is that what God told you? You know that's not the full truth, don't you? It's not that God doesn't want you to die. It's that God doesn't want you to become like Him. God's fearful of you. God's fearful that if you eat that, you're gonna have knowledge. You're gonna be just like God, and He's threatened by that. He's not afraid of death. He's afraid of you being like Him. Verse 5. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The implicit temptation is, don't you want to become like God? Don't you want to be just like God? Don't you want to be able to rule this land? And don't you want to be able to rule your own lives? And Adam, he's passively standing off in the distance, and he gives this shameful nod to Eve, go ahead and grab the fruit. It's okay. I mean, the thought of knowing, what is it going to be like to actually be like God? The knowledge, the power that comes with that, it was too strong of a desire for them to not turn away from. And so they indulged themselves in the wonder of the serpent's insights. And moments later, in paradise, this cold front blew in. The skies grew dark, and the voice that at one point was so familiar and so comforting to Adam and Eve spoke. And this time it shot fear into their gut. Something was wrong. They realized that they had done wrong and they had been lied to. I mean, they've been startled awake, but not from a nightmare, but into a nightmare. Their worst dreams became true. While the thought of becoming like God was for them in a moment's notice intoxicating, it was in reality deadly. So God speaks, and Adam and Eve, they hide. And God begins just asking this series of questions, and Eve finally confesses about the fruit and the serpent. And God recognizes the damage that has been done. Something went wrong, and it just continues to happen. It's almost this warlike scene taking place. I mean, you have in the very next scene in the Bible, their own son, Adam and Eve's sons, Cain and Abel. And it ends awfully. One of them ends up killing the other in anger. If we go back to God's conversation in Genesis 3, we find two important and critical details. We learn that the situation with the entrance of sin is far worse than any of us could have imagined. And we learned that the solution is unlike anything that we would have expected. Here's what it says. And God is pronouncing curses on creation. He's pronouncing curses on the man, on the woman, on creation, on the serpent. And here's what he says because of sin, because of the deception from the serpent. Verse 15. He says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman." The word enmity comes from the Hebrew word that describes the hostility that you would feel, that you would experience toward your enemy. I mean, it's not simply a matter of like, I don't like you, I dislike you. It's worse than that. It's like this war kind of feeling. I mean, there will be this continual battle, this continual conflict between the woman and the serpent. But not just for them. Look who else. And between your offspring and hers. This passage implies an ongoing conflict between two groups, two family lines, two kingdoms. You have humanity on the one hand, and then you have the offspring of the serpent on the other. And the serpent represents the spiritual figure that we later learn is called Satan. And so this conflict right here, and it becomes the ever-present problem throughout the Bible. God's people, they continue to get led astray. They continue to get deceived, continue to be at war, continue to be conquered and subjected to oppressive kings. And so the problem is, it's far worse because we recognize that this problem makes humanity prone to being deceived, to choosing hate, to choosing violence, to choosing rejection of God's word and God's standards continually. But more than that, I mean, there is this trap from which we cannot escape as humans. And as you read through the Bible, you don't just read about humans making poor decisions. You read about humans having this almost inescapable desire, this draw towards sin. It's almost like it is something that has enslaved humanity and they cannot get away from. It's a powerful desire that doesn't go away. And in fact, it fills some people to such an extent that they oppress and they do genocides. It's almost like in the garden, Adam and Eve handed humanity's own birthright over to the serpent, to this crooked father. But there's hope, because look what this passage says. It says, he, the seed of the woman, which is also, by the way, it's singular, so he will crush your head, speaking to the serpent. Your head is going to be crushed, serpent, and you will strike his heel. The serpent will strike at this person's heel. What is pictured here is the total destruction of the serpent that deceived, that enslaved, that destroys humanity. And in this part of the world, the most common snake that people thought of, it wasn't garter snakes, okay? It was poisonous vipers, okay? So when they talk about a snake striking at someone's heel, what is being described is a striking from a lethal snake, a deadly snake. This bite is deadly. And so there's this imagery here that Eve's offspring, a child, would be the true human, the true representative of humanity. One might say, this is the real Son of Man who would come and overthrow the serpent's rule. He would crush its head, and in the process, it would strike, and it would kill the offspring, kill Eve's offspring. In other words, victory would come through the Son of Man as he dies. And if you turn through your Old Testament, you don't find that kind of victory taking place. Well, until you get to Jesus. And the Gospels tell us that Jesus, he arrives as the true offspring of Eve. And Jesus' favorite title of himself was calling himself the Son of Man, which can be translated as the Son of Humanity. And he suddenly engages in this cosmic battle. I mean, you find these evil beings coming out of the woodworks for Jesus. And he even dies on the cross, and that death is not spoken of as a defeat. It is spoken of as a victory. And while the cross brought Jesus' death brought the crushing blow to the serpent's head. And in Matthew chapter 2, as the birth of Jesus unfolds, we find a strange conflict afoot. For some reason, Herod is fearful of his kingdom when there is an announcement of this new king to come and seize the throne. And so he does, ironically, the same thing that Pharaoh, Cain, and the serpent did. Use deception to bring about death. But quite unlike the story in Genesis 3, nobody falls into that trap. This time, nobody believes the lies. The arrival of this newborn baby Jesus is not just the birth of a baby. It's not just the welcoming of God to earth. It's not just the arrival of the king. It's also the end of the serpent's reign. It's the eviction notice that has been signed and sealed on cloth that has wrapped a baby lying in a manger. And he knows it. And so he won't go down without a fight. And here is the powerful thing about the biblical story of Jesus' birth. When you read back over the story, it pops out in a new way. I mean, suddenly we understand why there's a conflict with Jesus being born. We understand why there's a conflict with a baby. We understand why Herod flies off the rails and he tries to execute Jesus. We understand why his rhetorical tool is deception. The birth of Jesus was the fulfillment of God's curse against the serpent spoken a long, long time ago. It was the arrival of his defeat and the arrival of our hope. Victory was on the horizon as Jesus would go to the cross, taking our sin, taking our rebellion, taking humanity's rebellion upon himself. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that brought destruction into this world would soon be reversed as the Son of Man would be nailed to another tree. This tree, it wouldn't be found in a beautiful garden. It would actually be found on the outskirts of town, as this tree would be formed and manipulated into the form of a cross. Christmas is the arrival of God's Son to earth, but it's also the arrival of our hope. It's also the arrival of victory. But here's the deal. There's a sense in which conflict still continues. We still experience conflict, right? But Jesus was victorious over that, but we still have conflict. And so there's this inevitable tension between this. We know Jesus won the day, but the problem continues. Right? Marriages continue to fall apart. Siblings continue to fight. Media continues to deceive. Civil wars, they continue to happen. Churches continue to split. Christians continue to accuse one another. Diseases continue to spread. Curses continue to be thrown at one another in the name of a good cause. There's this ever-present conflict that continues. And there's always something waiting on the other side to knock you down when you get back up. And the challenge and the encouragement of Christmas is not just to remember Jesus' birth, it's also to remember what was set into motion because of Jesus' birth. That pot stir, that conflict creator, that slithering serpent lost the day the Son of Man was found lying in a manger. And the writer of Hebrews, he captures this conflict, this tension we find between hope and conflict, the tension we find with Jesus conquering evil and yet the presence of evil. He says it like this in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 8. Now in putting everything in subjection to him, Jesus, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who is for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. In the face of hardship, in the face of confusion, as we reflect on this Christmas story, on this Christmas season, As we get ready for Christmas, we don't just celebrate and remember the birth of Jesus the King, we remember the arrival of hope. And so what we need to do when we think about Christmas is we need to remember that long-awaited promise. It came to fulfillment. Satan was overthrown. And though now we still experience hardship, though now we still experience pain, we can look backwards confident that the God who won the day will see things through to the end. We can be confident of the future because we remembered the past. We can be confident moving forward as Christians, as people, because we remember what took place on Christmas. And it's almost like we can say this. As the good book says, if you spit in the air and the winds change, it doesn't land in your face. And that is in essence what Christmas is communicating. It reminds us the winds and the currents have changed because of what took place on Christmas Day. And because of that, we have hope. I'd like to invite the team to come forward to prepare for communion. And communion